Heavy rain hammered against the windows of the doctor's office as Robert Miller watched the drops streak down the glass, trying to find some pattern in the aquatic chaos. Anything was better than facing the compassionate gaze of Dr. Henry Morrison, who held a manila envelope containing test results as if it were a death sentence. 52 years of life, 30 of them dedicated to building a business empire that started with a small auto parts shop on the east side of the city and grew into the country's largest distributor of automotive components. Robert had achieved everything he had dreamed of as a boy. The penthouse on the Upper East Side, the private jet, the imported cars, the respect and the fear his name inspired in boardrooms. But at that moment, sitting in the leather chair of the most expensive medical practice in the city, none of it seemed to matter. If you enjoy gripping, true-to-life stories like this one, please hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your support means the world to us. Dr. Henry finally broke the silence that hung heavy in the air-conditioned room. His voice was soft, trained to deliver difficult news, but Robert noticed the hesitation behind every carefully chosen word. The tests confirmed what the persistent pain and constant fatigue had been announcing for months. A tumor in the pancreas, advanced stage, too aggressive for surgery, resistant to conventional treatments. Robert listened to the technical words, the medical terms that danced around the central truth, as if they could soften it. Carcinoma, metastasis, grim prognosis. The doctor spoke of palliative chemotherapy, quality of life, hospice care, but all Robert truly heard was the number. 6 months, maybe a year if he was lucky. A year for a man who had always planned decades ahead. He stood up before the doctor finished speaking, grabbed the envelope with the results and walked out of the office without looking back. He didn't want pity. He didn't need detailed explanations about something that had no solution. His entire life had been based on solving problems, finding loopholes, negotiating the impossible. But this was beyond any negotiation. His driver, Eddie, was waiting in the underground parking garage, reading a newspaper. Seeing Robert approach, he quickly folded the paper and opened the back door of the black Mercedes. He had known his boss for 15 years and knew when it was time to keep quiet. The expression on Robert's face was more closed off than usual. His shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. During the drive to the company headquarters, Robert looked out the tinted window, watching the city pass by like a movie in which he was no longer the protagonist. The city was buzzing with its usual chaotic energy. People rushed along the wet sidewalks. Vendors shielded their goods from the returning rain. Executives talked on cell phones while fighting for taxis. Everyone was in a hurry. Everyone had plans. Everyone assumed they would have tomorrow. His cell phone vibrated insistently in his jacket pocket. Robert ignored it. He knew it would be Julia, his executive assistant, chasing a response about the meeting with Japanese investors scheduled for that afternoon. Or maybe it was Mark, the CFO, wanting to discuss the quarterly numbers. Maybe even Carol, his ex-wife, demanding the increase in alimony he paid religiously every month, even though he was no longer legally obligated to do so. He had married Carol 25 years ago, when he was still a mid-sized entrepreneur with grand ambitions. She was beautiful, elegant, and came from an established, old-money family that provided the kind of social respectability that money couldn't buy. For 10 years, they maintained the facade of a perfect marriage. Charity dinners, trips to Europe, photos in society magazines. But Carol wanted a present husband, conversations at the end of the day, attention. And Robert only knew how to write checks. The divorce was discreet and expensive, with no children to fight over or hurt. It was just the cold inventory of a shared decade divided between lawyers. Carol got the house in the Hamptons and a hefty settlement. Robert was left with his solitude and his business. At the time, it seemed like a fair deal. Now, 15 years later, he wondered if he hadn't negotiated the wrong deal. They arrived at the mirrored skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan that housed the headquarters of Miller Distribution. 30 floors of glass and steel reflecting the heavy clouds. His name engraved in enormous letters on the facade. His legacy, his empire. And for what? For whom? Robert entered the private elevator that led directly to the 30th floor, where his executive suite was located. The doors closed with a mechanical whisper, and he saw his reflection in the mirror. Well-cut grey hair, impeccable Italian suit, silk tie, the image of success. But the sunken eyes and the yellowish tone of his skin betrayed something no expensive clothing could hide. Julia intercepted him as soon as he stepped out of the elevator. Blonde, hyper-efficient, always with a planner in hand and 3 pens clipped to her blazer pocket. She began to rattle off information about appointments, pending issues, urgent calls. Robert raised his hand, interrupting the verbal flow. "Clear my schedule for today," he said in a voice that brooked no argument. Julia blinked in surprise, her planner still open in her hands. "Everything," Robert repeated. "The meetings, the calls, the commitments. Say I had an unforeseen emergency." She nodded, still perplexed, and watched him enter the corner office and close the door. Alone at last, Robert walked to the panoramic window that dominated the city view. Below, the city stretched in all directions, a sea of concrete and glass punctuated by green areas. How many times had he stood at that same window, planning expansions, calculating profits, plotting acquisitions? The city had always been a chessboard where he moved his pieces with surgical precision. Now, the game had changed, and he no longer knew the rules. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. 3 rings before a female voice answered. Carol sounded genuinely surprised. To hear his voice outside the usual cycle of demands and payments, they exchanged uncomfortable pleasantries for a few minutes, dancing around an intimacy that no longer existed. Robert wanted to ask if she was happy, if she had found what she was looking for when she left the marriage, if she ever thought about him. But the words caught in his throat, choked by years of distance and pride. They ended up talking about the weather, about the relentless rain, about nothing. He hung up feeling lonelier than before. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange fog. Robert sat behind the mahogany desk, surrounded by awards and certificates that attested to his business excellence. He opened his laptop, looked at spreadsheets without really seeing them, signed documents without reading the content. Everything seemed to have lost its meaning, as if someone had erased the colors from the world. When the sky began to darken, tinging orange and purple behind the buildings, Robert decided to leave, not for the empty penthouse he called home, but for somewhere different. He needed to get out of that glass and steel bubble, to breathe air that wasn't filtered by central air conditioning. He dismissed Eddie and grabbed the keys to his Porsche. It had been months since he had driven himself, always delegating that task to the driver. But tonight, he needed to feel the steering wheel in his hands, to control at least something in his life that was falling apart. He drove aimlessly, letting the car take him through streets and avenues he knew by heart. He passed the illuminated avenues, drove down the main thoroughfares, crossed the elevated freeway. The city at night had a different energy, rather more honest. Here there were no corporate facades or fake smiles, just people living their imperfect lives. He ended up stopping at a dive bar in the village, one of those simple places that served cold beer and fried snacks. It wasn't the kind of establishment he frequented, but something about its authenticity drew him in. He sat at a formica table in the back, ordered a beer and watched the other patrons. Couples laughing, friends arguing about football, workers complaining about their bosses. Ordinary lives, everyday problems, simple joys. Robert realized with a sharp pang of envy that these people had something all his money hadn't bought. Real connections, genuine moments, someone to share the day's burden with. He drank the beer slowly, savoring the bitterness that mirrored what he felt inside. Dr. Henry had recommended avoiding alcohol during treatment, but what difference did it make now? 6 months, maybe a year. A blink of an eye in the grand scheme of things. The rain started again outside, drumming on the bar's awning. People rushed to take cover, sharing umbrellas, laughing at the situation. Robert paid the bill, left a generous tip that made the waiter blink in surprise, and stepped out into the rainy night. Back in the car, he sat for long minutes just listening to the rain hit the metallic roof. For the first time in decades, Robert Miller The business magnate, the man who had built an empire from scratch, didn't know what to do. All his planning skills, all his strategies, all his determination, none of it served to fight the enemy that had settled inside his own body. He started the car and began driving again. This time he knew where he was going. Back to the Upper East Side, to the empty penthouse, to the silent rooms that echoed his solitude. Tomorrow he would have to make decisions. Tell the team? Name a successor? Put the company up for sale? But today, on this rainy New York night, Robert just wanted to get home and perhaps for the first time in a long time admit to himself that he was afraid. Afraid not of the pain to come, not of the inevitable end, but of realizing that he had built an entire life heading in the wrong direction, and now there was no time to start over. The following days dragged on in a mechanical routine that Robert performed on autopilot. He woke up with the sun rising over the city, drank coffee alone on the penthouse balcony, put on one of the 30 identical suits hanging in his closet, and went to the office where he pretended everything was normal. But nothing was normal. Every meeting seemed like a theater of the absurd, every business decision a cosmic futility. Julia noticed that something was different. In the 15 years working for Robert, she had learned to read his mood swings like a meteorologist reads clouds. And these were storm clouds. He was quieter, more distant, as if a part of him had disconnected from the world. But every time she tried to ask if he was okay, he deflected the subject with the mastery of someone who had spent his life avoiding personal conversations. On Thursday of that week, Robert made a decision. He wouldn't tell anyone about the illness, not yet, maybe never. The idea of becoming an object of pity, of seeing that compassionate look Dr. Henry had on the face of everyone around him, was unbearable. He had built his reputation on strength and control. He wasn't going to shatter it now by revealing weakness, but there was something he needed to do, something he had been putting off for years out of sheer pride and stubbornness. He picked up the phone and called a number he had memorized but never used. 3 rings. 4. On the 5th, a deep voice answered, laced with surprise and suspicion. "Rick," Robert said, using the nickname he hadn't uttered in almost a decade. His younger brother was silent on the other end of the line, probably trying to process the fact that Robert, the older brother who had cut him out of his life after a nasty fight over their parents' inheritance, was calling. The conversation was tense, punctuated by uncomfortable pauses and thinly disguised resentment. Rick lived in a coastal town outside the city, worked as a high school history teacher, and lived a simple life with his wife Martha and their twin sons. A life Robert had always considered mediocre, devoid of ambition. But now, listening to his brother talk about the boys' soccer games, about modest beach vacations, about family dinners, Robert felt something he hadn't expected: envy. They ended the call with a vague promise to meet soon. Both knew it probably wouldn't happen, but the polite lie was more comfortable than the truth. Robert hung up feeling even emptier. He had a brother, nephews he barely knew, a family he had sacrificed on the altar of ambition. And for what? That evening, Robert did something unprecedented. He left the company at 6 in the evening, a time he usually considered practically morning. Eddie was so surprised he had to be called twice before bringing the car around. During the drive to the Upper East Side, Robert asked to pass by Central Park. He wanted to walk, feel the grass under his feet, see people living without the urgency that had dominated his life for decades. The driver dropped him off at one of the entrances, and Robert began walking along the tree-lined paths. It was early evening, and the park was still busy. Runners trained, couples courted on benches, families had late picnics. That's when he saw the boy for the first time. He was sitting alone on a bench near the lake, his feet dangling a few inches above the ground. He must have been 8 or 9, dark skin, messy curly hair, simple but clean clothes. What caught Robert's attention wasn't the boy's appearance, but what he was doing. He was writing something in an old notebook with a plastic cover, his tongue sticking out in absolute concentration. Robert initially walked past, but something made him stop and look back. The boy continued writing, oblivious to the world around him. There was a purity in that concentration, an intensity Robert recognized. That's how he himself had been in childhood, before life taught him that dreaming didn't pay the bills. "Hey kid," Robert heard himself call out before thinking better of it. The boy looked up, his eyes large and expressive. He showed no fear, only curiosity. Robert felt a pang of something that might have been shame. Since when did he approach strange children in parks? He was becoming a pathetic version of himself, but the boy smiled, a frank smile that lit up his face. "Hi, mister." He closed the notebook as if protecting a treasure. Robert walked up to the bench, keeping a respectful distance. He asked if the boy was alone, if his parents knew where he was. The boy explained that his mother worked late as a janitor in a nearby commercial building, and he waited there in the park, because it was safer than being on the street. "What's your name?" Robert asked. "Matthew," the boy replied. "Matthew Davis." "And you?" Robert hesitated. Introducing himself seemed to create a connection he wasn't sure he wanted. But there was something in the boy's direct gaze that demanded honesty. "Robert," he finally said. "Just Robert." They were silent for a moment, two strangers sharing a bench and nothing else. Then Matthew asked what Robert did, if he worked nearby. Robert could have lied, simplified, but he ended up telling the truth, that he owned a company, that he spent his days in meetings and making decisions about money. The boy listened with serious attention. "That must be boring," Matthew commented with the brutal honesty of children, being cooped up all day talking about money. Robert found himself laughing, a harsh sound from being so little used. "It is boring, yes," he admitted. "Very boring. But someone has to do it." Matthew shook his head. "No one has to do things they don't like. My mom always says that. She cleans floors because she needs to feed me, but in her free time she paints. One day she's going to have an exhibition, and then she can paint all day." The unwavering faith in the boy's voice made something tighten in Robert's chest. "And you?" Robert asked, pointing to the notebook. "What are you writing there?" Matthew gave a shy smile. "Stories about superheroes who save people. My teacher said I'm good with words, that maybe I can be a writer someday." He spoke with a mixture of hope and doubt, as if he wasn't sure that dreaming so big was allowed for someone like him. Robert felt a strange tug of emotion. When was the last time he had a dream that didn't involve expanding profits or acquiring competitors? When did he stop imagining possibilities that didn't fit into Excel spreadsheets? A whistle echoed through the park, signaling that closing time was near. Matthew quickly stood up, putting the notebook into his worn backpack. "I have to go. My mom should be finishing up soon. It was cool talking to you, Robert." He extended his hand, an adult gesture coming from a child who had probably needed to grow up too fast. Robert shook the small hand, surprised by the firmness of the grip. "It was cool for me too, Matthew. And about being a writer, go for it. The world needs good stories." The boy smiled, waved, and ran off down the path leading to the park exit. Robert remained seated on the bench for a few more minutes, watching the sky darken over the city. A casual encounter with a strange child shouldn't mean anything. It was just another one of those random interactions that happen in big cities. But there was something about that boy, that innocent hope that stirred something dormant inside him. In the following days, Robert found himself thinking about Matthew. Was the boy okay? Would his mother really achieve her dream of a painting exhibition? And what about the superheroes in the notebook? What stories were being written? On Monday, after another mind-numbing meeting about fiscal projections, Robert made an impulsive decision. He told Julia to cancel his afternoon commitments, something that was becoming a worrying habit, according to his assistant's expression. He took his car and drove to Central Park. He walked the same paths as the previous week, searching without admitting he was searching. And there he was, on the same bench, writing in the same notebook, as if the universe had conspired for them to meet again. Matthew looked up, and his face lit up in recognition. "Robert, you came back," he exclaimed with genuine joy. He didn't seem surprised, just happy, as if he expected adults to keep implicit promises to reappear. Robert sat down next to him, maintaining an appropriate but friendly distance. They talked about trivial things at first. how school had been, if his mother had managed to paint a little, what kind of superhero was being created today. Matthew spoke animatedly, gesturing with his hands, his eyes shining as he described his ideas. Then the boy became serious. "Can I ask you a personal question, Robert?" Robert nodded, curious about what a 9-year-old considered personal. "Are you happy?" The question dropped between them like a stone in a calm lake, creating ripples that spread in. Circles. Robert was speechless. How to answer that? How to explain to a child that happiness was a concept he had stopped considering relevant decades ago? That he had replaced satisfaction with success, joy with achievements, connection with conquests? "I don't think so," he finally replied with an honesty that surprised him. "I think I spent so much time trying to be successful that I forgot to be happy." The words came out raw, unpolished, straight from the wounded place he hid from everyone, including himself. Matthew nodded as if it made perfect sense. "My philosophy teacher." "Yes," he emphasized the word proudly. "Says that success without happiness is like having a ton of toys, but no one to play with. Do you have anyone to play with, Robert?" The simplicity of the metaphor was devastating. Robert thought of his empty penthouse, his solitary dinners, his achievements framed on the walls that no one but him saw. He had built a magnificent castle, but forgotten to populate it. "No," he admitted. "I guess I don't." Matthew placed his small hand on Robert's arm, a surprisingly mature gesture of comfort. "But it's not too late. My grandma always said before she passed away," he paused, and Robert understood the euphemism, "that we can always start over. Every day is a blank page." Robert felt his eyes sting unusually. When was the last time he had cried? He couldn't remember. Maybe at his mother's funeral. 15 years ago. Maybe not even then. He cleared his throat, pushing the emotion away. "You're a very wise kid." "Matthew," the boy smiled, "I just read a lot. And I observe, and I write. Writing helps you understand things." He looked at Robert with curiosity. "Have you ever tried writing about how you feel?" Robert almost laughed at the idea. He who could barely admit feelings to himself put them on paper. But there was something tempting about the suggestion, a way to bring order to the chaos that had settled in his mind since the diagnosis. "Maybe I should try," he said thoughtfully. Matthew immediately tore a sheet from his notebook and offered it along with the pencil. "Start now. Write one thing you feel." Robert looked at the blank paper in his hands. The pencil felt heavy, as if made of lead. What single word could summarize the turmoil inside him? Fear, loneliness? Regret? Slowly, with handwriting he hadn't used since school days, he wrote a single word. Lost. That solitary word on the paper, lost, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Matthew read it in silence, his expression too serious for a child his age. Then he took the paper back, flipped it over, and began writing something on the back. Robert watched curiously as the pencil danced across the page, forming careful letters. When he finished, Matthew folded the paper into 4 parts, creating a small square. "Keep this," he said, handing it back to Robert, "but only read it when you really need to. You'll know when it's time." There was a solemnity in the request that made Robert accept without question, tucking the folded paper into the inner pocket of his jacket. They talked a little longer before the park whistle interrupted them again. But this time, before leaving, Matthew made Robert promise he would return. Not tomorrow, because his mother had the day off and they would spend the day together. But the day after tomorrow, same place, same time, Robert promised, surprised by the sincerity of his own commitment. Back at the penthouse that night, Robert took the folded paper from his pocket and placed it on his bedroom dresser. He stared at it for long minutes, resisting the temptation to open it. There was something almost sacred in the way Matthew had given it to him, as if it were a talisman or a coded message from the universe. "You'll know when it's time," the boy had said, and something in Robert wanted to respect that. The next few days brought a subtle but noticeable change in his routine. Robert still went to the office, still signed documents and made decisions, but he had begun to delegate more, to trust his team of directors to solve problems he previously insisted on micromanaging. "Mark," the CFO commented in surprise that the boss seemed more relaxed. Julia simply watched in silence, worried but too respectful to invade Robert's privacy. On Wednesday, as promised, Robert returned to Central Park. Matthew was already there, but this time not alone. A woman was sitting beside him, also writing in a notebook. She must have been about 35, dark skin like her son's, long hair tied back in a practical ponytail. Simple clothes of someone who worked hard, but there was something elegant in her posture, a dignity that no expensive clothing could confer. Seeing Robert approach, Matthew jumped off the bench. "Robert, you came. Mom, this is the friend I told you about. He's really nice and has a huge company." The woman stood up, extending her hand with a warm smile, but in her eyes was the natural caution of a single mother protecting her child. "Beth," she introduced herself. "Matthew told me about you. Thank you for being kind to my son." Robert shook her hand, feeling the roughness of someone who worked with cleaning chemicals. "He's the one who's kind to me," he replied sincerely. "Your son is special, Beth." They talked for a few minutes, the initial tension gradually dissipating. Beth recounted how she juggled 3 jobs to ensure Matthew could attend a good school, have books, and have a chance at a different future than hers. She spoke with equal doses of pride and exhaustion. Robert listened, fascinated. Here was someone who understood true ambition, not his own empty and self-centered, but that of a mother fighting to give her son what she never had. Beth showed him some of her paintings on her phone, urban landscapes of the city seen through the eyes of someone who swept the floors. There was beauty in those images, a unique perspective of a city Robert thought he knew but realized now he only inhabited. "You have real talent," he said. "Have you ever thought about exhibiting professionally?" Beth laughed, but it was a humorless sound. "Exhibiting, Mr. Robert, costs money. Frames, space, promotion. It all costs money I don't have. So I paint so I don't go crazy and keep the canvases under the bed. Maybe someday." The resignation in her voice was painful to hear. Robert found himself wanting to help, offer money, solve the problem as he solved everything in his life, but something stopped him. He sensed that Beth had pride, that she wouldn't accept charity from a rich stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. And there was something else, a small voice inside him saying it wasn't about giving money. It had never been about money. Beth had to leave. She had another shift starting in an hour. She kissed the top of Matthew's head, thanked Robert again for keeping her son company, and quickly walked away. Robert and Matthew were alone again. "Your mom is amazing," Robert said. Matthew smiled with that unconditional love only children have. "She's the best. She works so hard so I can have a better life. That's why I need to study hard and be somebody, to repay everything she's done." The boy's maturity was moving and disturbing. No child should carry so much weight on their shoulders, so much sense of responsibility. But Robert saw in Matthew the same determination he himself had had in his youth. The difference was that Matthew still had light in his eyes, still believed in heroes and happy endings. They walked through the park as they talked. Matthew spoke about school, about his classmates, about the English teacher who encouraged his writing. Robert shared edited stories of his own childhood, about growing up poor on the East Side, about his father's auto parts shop that barely paid the bills. He was surprised to realize it had been decades since he had thought about those times. He had built a polished narrative of a self-made man for the business papers, but the truth was messier, more human. When the conversation drifted to dreams and plans, Matthew became animated. "I want to write books that make people feel less lonely, like the books I read do for me." He looked at Robert with that disconcerting frankness. "You feel lonely, don't you?" Robert could have denied it, deflected, built a polite wall, but he didn't. "Yes," he admitted, "very lonely. For a long time." Matthew nodded as if he understood perfectly. "Loneliness isn't about being alone. It's about having no one who truly sees you. My teacher said that." The observation hit Robert like a punch. That was exactly it. Surrounded by employees, associates, acquaintances, he was invisible. Everyone saw Robert Miller. The businessman, the magnate, the name in bold letters on the building facade. But who saw Robert, just Robert, with his fears and regrets, and that growing feeling that he had wasted something precious and irrecoverable? They sat on another bench, this one overlooking a field where children were playing soccer. Matthew took out his notebook and began writing, biting his lip in concentration. Robert just watched, appreciating the simple moment of being there, without an agenda, without goals, without the need to produce or conquer or impress. "Can I tell you a secret?" Matthew asked without lifting his eyes from the notebook. Robert said yes. "Sometimes I'm afraid I won't make it, that I won't be good enough, that I'll disappoint my mom. Everyone says I need to be somebody, be successful, but what if I fail? What if all her sacrifices are wasted?" Robert felt his heart clench. Here was a 9-year-old boy carrying the weight he himself had carried, and that had turned him into who he was today. Someone obsessed with success at the cost of everything else. Someone who never stopped because stopping meant looking back and seeing the void. "Matthew," Robert said, choosing his words carefully, "can I tell you something I learned too late?" The boy stopped writing and looked at him. "Success isn't what others say it is. It's not money or power or having your name on buildings. I have all that, and I tell you with absolute certainty that it's worth nothing if you lose yourself in the process." He took a deep breath. "Your mother doesn't want you to be rich or famous. She wants you to be happy. She wants you to have choices she didn't have. And writing, telling stories that make people feel less lonely, that's real success. That matters." Matthew processed the words in silence. "So you regret it? Becoming rich?" Robert shook his head. "I don't regret what I achieved. I regret what I lost along the way. The people I pushed away. The time I didn't truly live. Forgetting that money is just paper if there's no one to share it with." They were silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of the conversation. Then Matthew did something unexpected. He hugged Robert, a quick but sincere embrace that caught the man completely by surprise. "Thanks for telling me the truth," the boy said. "Adults always lie to kids thinking they're protecting us, but you're different." Robert felt something melt inside him, a layer of ice he hadn't known existed. When was the last time someone had hugged him spontaneously? When was the last time he had felt real human connection? Not transactional, not calculated. Matthew pulled away and returned to writing, now with renewed energy. Robert watched, thinking about all the choices he had made, all the paths not taken. He thought about the call with Rick that ended in empty promises. He thought about Carol and the years he had wasted in a loveless marriage. He thought about the employees he treated like cogs in an efficient machine. And he thought about the folded paper on his dresser, with a word written by him and something written by Matthew on the back. "You'll know when it's time." Had the time already come? Was the universe trying to tell him something through that unlikely boy who had appeared in his life just as everything was collapsing? The park whistle made them stand up. Matthew put away his notebook, adjusted his backpack. "Will I see you again?" he asked with that hope in his eyes. Robert nodded. "Yes, always." It was a big promise, perhaps too big, but at that moment under the orange sky of the New York sunset, Robert wanted to believe he could keep it. They said goodbye at the park gate. Robert watched Matthew join his mother, who was already waiting. The two walking together toward a bus stop, a pair of warriors facing the hostile city with nothing but love and hope. Robert stood still until they disappeared into the crowd. That night, alone in the penthouse, Robert retrieved the paper from the dresser. He sat on the balcony, the illuminated city stretching as far as the eye could see. All those lights, all those lives, all those stories he would never know. There was beauty in that vastness, but also an overwhelming loneliness. He unfolded the paper slowly. There was his word, Lawson, in his adult but shaky handwriting. He turned the paper over, and there, in Matthew's careful script, was the answer he didn't know he needed. 3 simple words that pierced all his defenses, words that a 9-year-old boy had written for a 52-year-old man, words that carried a wisdom transcending age or experience. "It's not too late, it's not too late." Robert read the 3 words repeatedly as the city sky darkened. Completely, 3 words that were both a promise and a challenge. Time for what exactly? To fix what he had broken? To build what he had never started? To truly live before time, ironically, finally ran out? That night, Robert couldn't sleep. He stayed on the balcony until dawn, the note in his hands, the city silently pulsing below. For the first time in weeks, Since the diagnosis that had turned his life into a countdown, Robert didn't feel just fear or anger or despair. He felt something different, possibility. The next morning, a Friday, Robert arrived at the office with a plan. Not the kind of strategic plan he usually drew up for acquisitions or expansions, but something more fundamental. A plan to reclaim parts of himself he thought were lost forever. He called Julia into his office and, for the first time in 15 years, genuinely asked about her. Not about the agenda or the reports, but about her life. He discovered she had a 7-year-old daughter, Sophia, who loved ballet, but the dance school was expensive. He discovered that Julia dreamed of getting a master's in management but didn't have time between work and being a single mom. Discovered that his assistant was a complete person, with dreams and fears and an entire life happening outside that office. Robert found himself ashamed for never having asked before. After Julia left, surprised and moved by the conversation, he called individual meetings with each director. Mark from finance, Anne from marketing, George from operations. With each one, he did the same thing. He turned off the businessman mode and turned on the human mode. Anne cried as she recounted that her mother had advanced Alzheimer's, that she spent sleepless nights worrying, that she felt torn between work and family. George confessed he was in therapy for anxiety, that the pressure of the job was affecting his health. Mark admitted his marriage was hanging by a thread, that he barely saw his children growing up. Robert listened to everything, and for the first time, he didn't offer corporate solutions or expectations that they leave their personal problems outside. He offered empathy, he offered flexibility, he offered humanity. Something had changed in him. As if Matthew's note had unlocked a part of his soul he had kept frozen for decades. That afternoon, he did another unthinkable thing. He called Rick. This time, the conversation was different. Robert started by apologizing. Apologies for the fight over the inheritance, for the abrupt cutoff, for years of stupid pride. Rick's voice trembled on the line. They talked for almost 2 hours, dismantling resentments built brick by brick over a decade. Rick talked about the twins, Peter and Paul, now 13, how they were good students, how they played soccer on the school team, how they asked about the rich uncle they never saw. Robert felt a pang of loss. He had teenage nephews he didn't know, who had grown up believing he didn't care. They arranged a lunch for Sunday, something simple, at Rick's house in the coastal town. Just family, no pomp, no formalities, just people trying to rebuild burned bridges. Robert hung up feeling lighter than he had in years, but there was someone else who needed to hear. That night, Robert drove to Carol's apartment in the West Village. She answered the intercom, surprised, clearly suspicious of this unexpected visit. But she let him come up. Carol looked different. Her hair was shorter, a few wrinkles he didn't remember, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Peace, perhaps. She had made a life after him, Robert realized, a life that didn't revolve around unmet expectations and solitary dinners. They had coffee in the small, tastefully decorated living room, so different from the soulless opulence of his penthouse. Robert didn't know where to start, so he started with the truth. He told her about the illness. He saw the shock on her face, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. He didn't want pity, he quickly explained. I just needed her to know because I had to say something I should have said 15 years ago. Chloe, you deserved better. You deserved a husband who was present, attentive, who saw you as a person, not just an accessory. And I am so sorry for being so selfish, so focused on building an empire that I forgot to build a life. You tried to tell me that so many times, and I just wouldn't listen. Tears streamed down her face. Richard continued, did you find someone? She nodded. Robert, a music teacher. They got married 5 years ago. Quietly, he's kind, Chloe said softly. He shows up when he says he will. He remembers my birthday. He asks about my day and actually listens to the answer. Richard smiled, genuinely happy for her. You deserve exactly that, and he's lucky to have you. They talked more, finally dismantling the weight of a marriage that should never have happened. When Richard left hours later, they hugged at the door. An embrace between two people who had shared a decade of life and were finally making peace with it. The weekend was strange and wonderful all at once. On Saturday, Richard drove to the auto parts store that had started the empire. He hadn't visited the place in years, maintained by efficient managers who sent monthly reports. The original store in the East End, modernized but still recognizable. Walter, the manager, a 60-year-old man who had worked there since Richard's father was alive, nearly fell out of his chair when he saw him. The employees tensed up, thinking it was a surprise inspection, but Richard just asked to talk. He spent the day there, helping at the counter, chatting with customers, sweating in the heat that the old air conditioner barely relieved. It was like stepping back in time, to when he was 18 working with his dad, learning every bolt, every part, dreaming of expansion. Walter told stories about Richard's father that he had never heard. How old Mr. Almeida helped customers who were struggling financially, how he gave special pricing to mechanics just starting out, how he believed a good business was one where everyone won. Richard realized, sadly, that in his eagerness to grow, he had abandoned those principles his father valued. On Sunday, he drove to Santos. Ryan's house was simple, a two-story home in a middle-class neighborhood, small but well-kept garden. Martha, his sister-in-law, whom he barely knew, greeted him with a warm hug. The twins, Peter and Paul, were shy at first, but quickly warmed up when Richard asked about their soccer team and showed genuine interest. Lunch was homemade, cooked by Martha with Ryan's help. Nothing fancy, just good, plentiful food. They talked, laughed, and shared stories. Richard told them about Matthew, about the note, about this strange journey of rediscovery. Ryan listened in silence, then placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "I'm proud of you. Man, I know it wasn't easy. Admitting you were on the wrong path, the most people never manage to do that." Richard felt his eyes sting. Again. He had cried more in those 2 weeks than in the last 20 years, combined. Driving back to São Paulo, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in so long he barely recognized it. Contentment, not the euphoria of closing a multi-million-dollar deal or the satisfaction of crushing a competitor. Just the quiet peace of being connected to people who mattered. Monday arrived, and with it, difficult decisions. Richard called an extraordinary meeting with the board of directors. He announced he was gradually stepping back, that he would delegate more responsibilities, and that he trusted the team to handle the day-to-day operations. The room fell into shocked silence. Michael found the courage to ask the obvious. "Is everything all right, Mr. Almeida?" Richard smiled. Everything was far from all right in the medical sense, but in another, perhaps more important sense, he was better than he had been in decades. "Let's just say I had a revelation about priorities," he answered enigmatically. Later that day, Richard went to Ibirapuera Park as usual. Matthew was there, writing intensely. Seeing Richard, his face lit up. "You look different," the boy observed with that disconcerting perception. Lighter. Richard sat down next to him. "I read what you wrote in the note." Matthew smiled. "And? Did it help?" Richard nodded. "It changed everything. Those 3 words, 'It's not too late,' did more for me than years of therapy ever could. They gave me permission to start over." The boy looked satisfied. "Sometimes we just need a reminder that it's not too late." They talked about their respective weeks. Matthew told him about an essay he had written for school, praised by his teacher. Richard told him about reconciling with his brother, visiting his father's store, and starting to truly see the people around him. With every story, Matthew listened with that total attention only children can give. "You know what I realized?" Richard said thoughtfully. "I spent my whole life thinking I needed to accumulate things to matter. Money, power, properties. But it's not the things that last, it's the moments, it's the connections. It's sitting here talking to you about nothing and everything all at once." Matthew was quiet for a moment, swinging his legs that didn't reach the ground. "Then my mum was right. She always says what matters isn't what you have, but who you are and how you make others feel." Richard felt that simple truth pierce him once more. Beatrice arrived shortly after, coming straight from work. She greeted Richard warmly. already accustomed to his presence in her son's life. They talked briefly, and Richard impulsively extended an invitation. "Would you like to have dinner with us sometime soon? Nothing fancy, just to get to know you better." Beatrice hesitated, that wounded pride Richard recognized, but Matthew jumped up excitedly. "Please, Mom. We can make your spaghetti, the best in the world." Beatrice looked between her son and Richard, then smiled. "All right. Saturday?" Richard agreed, feeling an anticipation that was strange and wonderful. As he walked back to his car, Richard thought about how different his life looked now compared to just 3 weeks ago. The diagnosis was still there, the sentence still unchanged, but something fundamental had shifted. He still had 6 months, maybe a year. And for the first time, he was determined to truly live every second. The days leading up to Saturday passed in a whirlwind of changes. Richard implemented new policies at the company that left everyone speechless. Flexible hours for parents, educational assistance for employees who wanted to study, a mentorship program where he would personally guide young entrepreneurs from underserved communities. It was as if he had woken up from a 30-year sleep. Julia got a full scholarship for her graduate degree through a fund Richard created for employee professional development. Anna managed to reduce her workload to care for her mother without losing salary. Michael started leaving earlier on Fridays for family dinner. Small changes that meant entire worlds to those who received them. But it wasn't just corporate generosity. Richard discovered something surprising in the process. Seeing the people around him flourish, seeing genuine gratitude in their eyes, gave him a satisfaction no quarterly profit had ever provided. It was as if he had discovered a completely different kind of wealth. On Thursday, he received an unexpected call. Dr. Henry wanted to see him to discuss new test results. Richard felt his stomach clench. Since the initial diagnosis, he had been putting off going back to the doctor, as if not going meant the disease wasn't progressing. But he knew that was an illusion. He scheduled the appointment for Friday morning. In the office, Dr. Henry had an expression Richard couldn't decipher. The new test showed something intriguing. The tumor wasn't growing at the expected speed. In fact, it seemed to have stabilized. Dr. Henry was cautious, explaining that this didn't mean cure or reversal. But it was unusual enough to warrant attention. Richard listened, stunned. Stabilized? How? Why? The doctor had theories about immune response, individual variations, about science still not fully understanding how the body sometimes fought in unexpected ways. But deep down, Richard felt he knew the reason, or at least, he wanted to believe he knew. Since reading Matthew's note, since starting to truly live instead of just existing, something had changed not only in his mind but in his body. There were studies about it. Dr. Henry mentioned almost reluctantly about how emotional state could affect disease progression. Happiness, purpose, connection, they didn't cure, but sometimes they gave the body extra strength to fight. Richard left the office in a state of hopeful shock. He still had the disease, it was still serious, but he had gained something precious. Time. Maybe not 6 months, maybe a year, maybe more. Every additional day was a gift he hadn't expected to receive. Saturday arrived sunny, rare for São Paulo that time of year. Richard drove to the address Beatrice had provided, a housing complex in the south side. The building was simple but well maintained, with a small green area where children played. So different from the penthouse in Jardins, but there was life there, community, something the concrete and glass of his world never had. Matthew was waiting for him at the gate, jumping excitedly. Richard had brought flowers for Beatrice and a high-quality writing kit for Matthew, special paper notebooks, pens of different colors, a book on narrative techniques. The boy held the gift as if it were the most valuable treasure in the world. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, integrated living room and kitchen. But Beatrice had transformed that space into a home. There were paintings everywhere, her views of São Paulo seen from angles only those who truly lived the city knew. Plants on the windows, colorful handmade curtains, photos of Matthew through all phases of childhood. Beatrice was in the kitchen, preparing the promised spaghetti. The smell coming from there was comforting, reminding Richard of his childhood. The rare times his mother had time to cook before she passed away too young. He offered to help, and Beatrice, after hesitating, accepted. Soon Richard was chopping tomatoes while she prepared the sauce, Matthew in the living room writing in his new notebook. They talked while they cooked. Beatrice told her story, growing up in an orphanage inland, coming to São Paulo at 16 looking for opportunities, getting pregnant young by a boyfriend who disappeared when he heard the news, raising Matthew alone, working 3 jobs, never giving up the dream of painting even when it seemed impossible. Richard listened with growing admiration. Here was true strength, true determination. Not his, who had built an empire but devastated relationships in the process, but hers, who maintained dignity and hope while scrubbing other people's flaws so her son could have books. "And you?" Beatrice asked while stirring the sauce. "Matthew tells me you are very rich, very successful, but he also says you are sad, or he says you are changing." The frankness of the observation could have been offensive, but Beatrice spoke with kindness, genuine curiosity. Richard considered how to respond. He ended up telling the truth about the disease, about the life wasted on empty ambition, about the note Matthew had written, and how 3 simple words made him reevaluate everything. Beatrice stopped stirring the sauce and looked at him with tears in her eyes. "My son has a special heart," she said softly. "Since he was little, he feels things differently. He truly sees people." And she paused, choosing her words carefully. "People like you who get lost along. The way need people like him to remember what matters." But she hesitated before continuing. Richard encouraged her to speak. Beatrice took a deep breath. "I'm just afraid Matthew gives too much of himself, that he carries other people's pain on his back. He's still a child. He should be worried about games and playing, not saving lost adults." There was no accusation in her voice, just a mother's protective concern. Richard understood perfectly. "You're right, and I promise I won't overburden him. But he did something for me that honestly saved me, and I want to repay him. Not with money," he added quickly, seeing Beatrice's expression, "but with presence, with being someone he can count on. Like an uncle, maybe, or an older friend." Beatrice studied his face for long moments. Then she nodded. "Matthew needs positive male figures in his life. And you, it seems to me, need true connection. Maybe you can help each other." They sealed the agreement with a smile and returned to preparing dinner. The meal was one of the best Richard had ever had. Not for the sophistication, which was 0, but for the company, the lightness, the genuine laughter. Matthew told elaborate stories about the characters he created. Beatrice shared hilarious anecdotes from her jobs, and Richard discovered he had a talent for making funny voices that left Matthew in stitches. After dinner, Beatrice showed him more paintings. Richard was genuinely impressed. She had real artistic vision, a unique style that captured the soul of São Paulo in a way he had never seen. An impulse surged in him, but this time he thought carefully before speaking. "Beatrice," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I know a gallery owner, Santiago, in Vila Madalena. He's always looking for emerging artists with a fresh perspective. Can I show him your work? I won't buy the space or pressure him. Just an honest introduction. If he likes it, great. If not, you haven't lost anything." Beatrice bit her lip, clearly torn between hope and fear of rejection. Matthew jumped up beside her. "Do it, Mom. Your paintings are amazing." Beatrice looked between her son and Richard, then nodded slowly. "All right, but just the introduction. I'll talk about my work myself." Richard agreed immediately. That was exactly how it should be. The evening wore on with conversation and laughter. Richard realized it was almost 11 when he checked the clock, astonished at how quickly the time had passed. Normally, social events left him exhausted, anxious to escape. But here, in that simple apartment with those 2 extraordinary people, he felt at home in a way he never had in his luxury penthouse. Saying goodbye at the door, Matthew hugged him tightly. "Thanks for coming, Richard, and thanks for being my friend. Adults usually don't really want to be friends with kids, but you're different." Richard felt his chest tighten with emotion. "The privilege is mine. You taught me more in a few weeks than I learned in 50 years. Beatrice hugged him too, less reserved now. Thank you for seeing my son, for truly seeing him, and thank you for letting him see you too. People don't do that anymore, truly letting others in. Richard just nodded, a little emotional to trust his voice. On the drive back to Jardin, Richard turned on the radio and found himself humming along. When was the last time he had sung? He couldn't remember. The city passed by the window, the same streets as always, but they looked different now, more colorful, more alive, more full of possibility. On Monday, Richard called Santiago and scheduled a meeting to show him photos of Beatrice's paintings. The gallery owner was an eccentric fellow, but had a keen eye for talent. He looked at the images in silence for long minutes, making that thoughtful sound art connoisseurs make. "Who is she?" he finally asked. Richard told Beatrice's story without embellishment, without making her a charity case, just the facts. A talented woman who worked hard and painted in the hours stolen from exhaustion. Santiago nodded slowly. "Bring her in. I want to talk. I don't promise anything, but there's something in these paintings, sole truth. Things that are missing in a lot of the technical work I say." Richard left the gallery with a light heart. He called Beatrice immediately. She answered breathlessly, "Between jobs." When he told her about Santiago's interest, there was silence on the line, then sobs. She was crying. Richard grew alarmed, asking if everything was all right. "It's all right," she managed to say through tears. "It's more than all right. I've dreamed of this for so long I thought it would never happen, and you barely know me. But you're doing this for me." Richard felt his own eyes well up. "You deserve it. Beatrice, your talent deserves to be seen." That week, Richard also organized another gathering. He called Ryan and proposed something bigger, a full family lunch. Ryan, Martha and the twins, Beatrice and Matthew, and himself, uniting the people who were becoming his makeshift family, his chosen tribe. The lunch happened at the penthouse, but Richard asked Beatrice to cook. She protested initially, but he insisted. They transformed the designer kitchen he never used into a warm, welcoming space. The twins and Matthew hit it off immediately, discovering a shared passion for soccer and comics. Ryan and Beatrice talked about the challenges of raising children, finding common ground despite their different socio-economic realities. Martha praised the paintings Richard had strategically hung around the house, Beatrice's work. It was chaotic, noisy, wonderful. The penthouse had never been so alive. While everyone talked in the living room after lunch, Richard stood alone on the balcony for a moment. He looked at the city below and thought about how everything had changed. The tumor was still there. He occasionally felt the aches, saw the fatigue that wouldn't completely pass, but it had stabilized. And he had gained time. Time for this. For family, for connection, for truly living. Matthew appeared beside him, always sensing when someone needed company. "You're happy now?" the boy asked. It wasn't really a question. Richard looked at that young face carrying so much wisdom and smiled. "Yes," he answered with total honesty. "For the first time in a long time, I am genuinely happy." 3 months passed since that family dinner at the penthouse. 3 months that proved miracles don't need to defy the laws of physics, only transform lives from the inside out. Richard's tumor remained stabilized, defying all medical expectations. Dr. Henry spoke in cautious terms about spontaneous remission, rare but documented phenomena, mysteries of medicine. But Richard knew the truth, deep in his heart. It wasn't just his body fighting, it was his soul, finally finding a reason to stay. Beatrice had her first exhibition at Santiago's gallery. It wasn't a resounding success in conventional terms, but 3 paintings were sold, and 2 art magazines ran features on her work. More importantly, she managed to cut down to 2 jobs, dedicating more time to painting. The dream was becoming reality, one small step at a time. Matthew continued writing his superhero stories. Richard had read some and was genuinely impressed. There was talent there, not just childish imagination, but a real ability to tell stories that touched the heart. Richard used his connections to get a children's book publisher to read the boy's work. They offered a contract to publish a collection of short stories when Matthew turned 12. Ryan and he now spoke. Weekly, the twins called Richard uncle and bombarded him with texts about soccer and requests to visit the penthouse, which they thought was the coolest place in the world. Martha joked that Richard was spoiling the boys rotten, but her eyes shone with gratitude for having the family she thought she had lost back. At the company, the changes Richard had implemented were bearing unexpected fruit. Productivity had increased, employee turnover had dropped drastically, and there was a new spirit in the air, as if everyone had been reminded they were human first and workers second. Michael commented that it was the best phase the company had seen in years. It was a sunny Saturday morning when Richard received a call that would change everything once more. Beatrice, her voice tight. She needed to see him urgently. She was at the hospital. Richard felt his heart race. Matthew. No, she said quickly. Matthew was fine. It was something else. He promised to go immediately. At the hospital, he found Beatrice in the waiting room, her eyes red from crying. Seeing him, she stood up and hugged him tightly, her body trembling. Richard felt panic rise. What happened? Where is Matthew? Beatrice led him to a room where the boy was lying in bed, seemingly asleep, connected to monitors. Richard's world stopped. No, he thought desperately. Not him, not the boy who had saved his life. But then he noticed something. Matthew wasn't in critical condition. He was just sleeping, breathing regularly, his face peaceful. Beatrice saw his confusion and finally managed to speak. In the last few days, she explained, Matthew had been more tired, with back pain. She thought it was growing pains, a kid thing, but this morning he couldn't get out of bed. She rushed him to the hospital. The doctors ran tests, many tests, and they discovered something. Richard held his breath, bracing himself for the worst possible news. Matthew has a kidney problem, Beatrice continued, her voice breaking. Advanced renal failure, congenital. That went unnoticed all these years. He's going to need a transplant. But she stopped, tears streaming. But I'm not a match. We already ran the tests, and we don't have any other relatives. No one. The revelation hit Richard like an avalanche. This extraordinary boy, who had given him so much hope, so much light, so much life, now needed help his mother couldn't give. And the waiting list for kidney transplants was long, sometimes fatal for those who didn't have time to wait. Richard didn't think. He didn't calculate. He didn't evaluate risks. Test me, he said immediately. Test my blood. Beatrice looked at him stunned. Richard, you can't. You have your own illness. Richard held her hands. I have 2 kidneys and a stabilized tumor. If I'm a match, there's no discussion. He saved my life. It's time for me to repay him. The doctors initially hesitated, citing potential complications given Richard's medical history. But he was insistent, relentless, using all that determination that built his empire to fight for something that truly mattered. They ran the tests. The wait for the results was agony. When the doctor returned 2 hours later, his expression was unreadable. Then he smiled. Perfect match. It was rare, almost impossible between non-relatives, but it happened, as if the universe had conspired for these two, the lost millionaire and the wise boy, to meet exactly when they needed each other most. The next few days were a blur of surgical preparations, conversations with specialists, endless paperwork. Richard contacted the best surgeons, ensuring everything would be done at the best hospital with the best team. His money finally served a purpose that truly mattered. Matthew woke up on the second day and, upon understanding what Richard planned to do, he cried, "But you might need it," the boy said weakly. "What if your tumor comes back and you need to be strong?" Richard sat on the edge of the hospital bed, taking the small hand in his. "Matthew," he said softly, "you gave me something much more valuable than a kidney. You gave me a reason to live. You gave me purpose. You showed me that it's not too late. That note you wrote, those 3 words saved me. Now it's my turn to save you." The surgery was scheduled for the following week. The night before, Ryan and his family came to the hospital. Julia and the company directors showed up with flowers and cards. Chloe called crying, saying she was proud of him. Even Walter from the original store showed up, saying Richard's father would be happy seeing the man his son had become. The waiting room was full of people. Richard's makeshift family, all united by worry but also by hope. Beatrice sat between Ryan and Martha, surrounded by support. The twins entertained everyone with funny stories to ease the tension. The surgery lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of silent prayers, holding hands of community. When the surgeon finally came out, tired but smiling, the entire room seemed to exhale in unison. Beyond, "We're fine. The surgery was a success. The kidney was working perfectly and Matthew recovery was slow but steady." Richard and Matthew stayed in neighboring rooms, visiting each other as soon as they could walk. They sat together, sharing comfortable silences, sometimes talking, sometimes just existing in the same space. On one of those afternoons, Matthew asked Richard if he was scared. Of what? Richard asked. Of giving away a piece of yourself. Of getting weaker. Richard thought carefully before answering. "I am stronger now than I have ever been, because for the first time, I did something that truly matters. I didn't build anything. I didn't buy anything. I didn't conquer anything. I just gave, and I discovered that giving is the only thing that truly fills us." Matthew smiled that world-illuminating smile. "You got it," the boy said simply. "You finally got it." And Richard realized that yes, he had understood. Life wasn't about accumulating or conquering or impressing. It was about connecting, giving, loving, living every moment fully as if it were the last, because maybe it was. 3 weeks later, both were discharged. A small party was organized at the penthouse, now a vibrant place full of life and laughter and love. Everyone was there, all of Richard's chosen family, celebrating not just the recovery, but the complete transformation of a man who thought he had lost everything and discovered he still had time to gain what truly mattered. That night, alone on the balcony after everyone had left, Richard looked at the city that seemed different now. Not because it had changed, but because he had changed. He touched the scar on his side where a kidney used to be and smiled. He had given a piece of himself, and in return received something immeasurable: family, purpose, true life. Matthew's note was still kept in his wallet, those 3 words that transformed everything. It's not too late. And he had used that time not to build more wealth or power, but to build something much more precious. Real connections, genuine love, a legacy measured not in dollars but in lives touched. Richard didn't know how. Much time he had left. The tumor was stabilized, but medicine offered no guarantees. Maybe 6 months, maybe a year, maybe decades, but it didn't matter anymore, because now, for the first time in his life, Richard was living every day fully, surrounded by people he loved and who loved him back. And that, he realized with crystal clarity, was the only kind of wealth truly worth having. The moon shone over São Paulo, millions of stories happening under its silver gaze. And in a penthouse in Jardim, a man who had been a lonely millionaire and had become just Richard, friend, brother, uncle, donor, finally understood the true meaning of success. It wasn't in what you conquered, but in who you became and the lives you touched along the way. End of story, dear listeners. We hope the story of Richard and Matthew touched your hearts deeply. Stories like this remind us that it's never too late to start over, to reconnect, to truly live. Richard discovered that the greatest wealth isn't in the things we accumulate, but in the people we love and the moments we share. If this narrative resonated with you, if you also believe that it's not too late to transform your life and touch the hearts of others, we would love to know. Leave your comment below sharing your reflections on this journey. What part of the story moved you the most? Do you have a Matthew in your life who taught you something precious? Or perhaps you are someone's Matthew? Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories we prepare with such care. Every narrative is a window into the human soul, an opportunity to see the world through different eyes. Don't forget to hit that like button if this story touched your heart, as it helps us continue bringing these reflections to more people. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message that it's not too late, share this story. Sometimes 3 simple words from a wise boy are all we need to completely change direction. We'll see you in the comments and in the next story. Until then,